Mr. Kelly, aye. Ms. Cinema, no. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Thune, no. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst? No.
On this vote, the yeas are 50, the nays are 49, and the nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will immediately be notified of the Senate's action. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to legislative session.
Madam President.
Senator from Vermont.
Madam President, pursuant to Section 36B of the Arms Export Control Act, I move to discharge the Committee on Foreign Relations from further consideration of S.J. Res. 111 relating to the disapproval of the proposed foreign military sale to the government of Israel of certain defense articles and services.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Vermont, Mr. Sanders, moves to discharge S.J. Res. 111.
I would ask unanimous consent to dispense with further reading of the resolution.
Under the previous order, there will now be 2 hours of debate equally divided between proponents and opponents.
Madam President, thank you very much. And let me thank the leadership for their cooperation in setting up this debate. Today, we will be voting on 3 joint resolutions of disapproval, or JRDs, to block the sale of certain offensive weapons to Israel. These resolutions are S.J. Res. 111, to block the sale of 120-millimeter tank rounds, S.J. Res. 113, to block the sale of 120-millimeter high-explosive mortar rounds, and S.J. 115, to block the sale of JDMs, the guidance kits attached to many of the bombs dropped in Gaza. Madam President, I would note to my colleagues that these resolutions are strongly supported by more than 100 civil society groups, including pro-Israel groups like J Street, some of the largest labor unions in this country, including the SEIU, the United Auto Workers, and the United Electrical Workers, humanitarian groups like Amnesty International and Doctors of the World, and religious groups like the United Methodist Church, the Friends Committee, and many, many other organizations. And Madam President, I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the list of these supporting organizations.
Without objection.
Madam President, I would also point out that poll after poll shows that a strong majority of the American people oppose sending more weapons and military aid to fund Netanyahu's war machine. And I would also mention, interestingly enough, that according to a poll commissioned by J Street, this is a pro-Israel organization, 62% of Jewish Americans support withholding weapons shipments to Israel until Netanyahu agrees to an immediate ceasefire. Madam President, these resolutions are aimed at offensive weapons that have been used to devastating effect against civilians in Gaza and Lebanon. They would not affect any of the systems Israel uses to defend itself from incoming attacks. Madam President, from a legal perspective, these resolutions are simple, straightforward, and not complicated. Bottom line, the United States government must obey the law, not a very radical idea. But unfortunately, that is not the case now. And every member of the Senate who believes in the rule of law, that our government should obey the law, should vote for these resolutions. The Foreign Assistance Act and the Arms Export Control Act are very clear. The United States cannot provide weapons to countries that violate internationally recognized human rights or block U.S. humanitarian aid. Let me repeat that, because that is the essence of this entire debate, not complicated. The United States government cannot provide weapons to countries that violate internationally recognized human rights or block U.S. humanitarian aid. That is not my opinion. That is what the law says. Madam President, according to the United Nations, according to much of the international community, according to virtually every humanitarian organization on the ground in Gaza, Israel is clearly in violation of these laws. Under these circumstances, it is illegal for the United States government to provide Israel with more offensive weapons. These joint resolutions of disapproval are Congress's tool to enforce the law, and that is exactly what we must do. Madam President, it has been more than 13 months since the October 7th Hamas terrorist attack on Israel, an attack which killed 1,200 innocent people and took 250 hostages, including Americans. As I have said many, many times, Israel had the absolute right to respond to that horrific Hamas attack as any other country would. I don't think anybody here in the United States Senate disagrees with that. But Prime Minister Netanyahu's extremist government has not simply waged war against Hamas. It has waged an all-out war against the Palestinian people. Madam President, within Gaza's population of just 2.2 million people, and I want people to conceptualize that, that's about the size of New Mexico. 2.2 million people, more than 43,000 Palestinians have been killed, and more than 103,000 injured, a population of about the size of New Mexico. 60% of those who have been killed and injured are women, children, or elderly people. According to satellite imagery, 2/3 of all structures in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. 2/3 of all structures, think about that. 2/3 of all structures have been damaged or destroyed. That includes 87% of the housing, 84% of health facilities, 84% of health facilities, and 70% of sanitation plants. Right now, there is raw sewage running through the streets of Gaza, and it is very difficult for the people there to obtain clean drinking water. Madam President, every one of Gaza's 12 universities has been bombed. They got 12 universities. Every single one of them has been bombed, as have many hundreds of schools. For 13 months, there has been no electricity in Gaza. Madam President, during the last year, millions of desperately poor people in Gaza have been repeatedly driven from their homes and forced to evacuate time and time again with nothing more than the clothes on their backs. So let's imagine millions of people driven from their homes, told to go here, told to go there, and going from one place to another. Families in Gaza have been herded into so-called safe zones, only to face continued bombardment. They're told to go to this area, and the bombs start falling, and the children start dying. Madam President, the children of Gaza have suffered a level of physical and emotional abuse that is almost beyond comprehension. Abuse that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. These children, today, as we speak, right now, are hungry, they are thirsty, they cannot access health care, and all around them, they have witnessed death and destruction. That is what the children of Gaza have experienced, and Gaza is a very young population. And Madam President, as horrific as that situation is, what has happened over the last year, what is taking place today, right now, this moment, as we discuss this issue, it is even worse, if that is imaginable. As a result of Israel blocking desperately needed humanitarian aid, the volume of aid getting into Gaza in recent weeks is lower than at any point since the war began. More aid is needed, less aid is getting through. The result, many thousands of children are facing malnutrition and starvation. Let me repeat that. Many thousands of children today are facing malnutrition and starvation. This is not my observation. This is what the leaders of the 19 most important humanitarian organizations on the ground in Gaza, including the American head of UNICEF, Kathy Russell, and the American head of the World Food Program, Cindy McCain, wife of our former colleague John McCain. That is what they say. according to their recent report, quote, "The situation unfolding in North Gaza is apocalyptic. Basic life-saving goods are not available. Humanitarians are not safe to do their work and are blocked by Israeli forces and by insecurity from reaching people in need," end of quote. And they continue. As a result, quote, "The entire population in North Gaza is at imminent risk of dying from disease, famine, and violence," end of quote. These are the 19 major humanitarian organizations operating in Gaza right now, including several of the major ones led by Americans. And Israel's recent decision to ban UNRWA, the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza, will only make a horrific situation even worse. Madam President, I have met with doctors who have served in Gaza, treating hundreds of patients a day without electricity, without anesthesia, without clean water, including dozens of children arriving with gunshot wounds in the head. I've seen the photographs and the videos, and we have some of them here. I've heard from UNICEF, who estimate that 10 children lose a leg in Gaza every single day. There are now more than 17,000 orphans in Gaza. Madam President, let me quote from a New York Times opinion piece of October 9th, 2024, a little more than a month ago, where American doctors and nurses in Gaza, these are Americans working in Gaza, describe what they saw on the ground. Merrill Tidings is a nurse from New Mexico, and she said, quote, "These people were starving." She's talking about healthcare workers, her colleagues. "These people were starving. I learned very quickly to not drink in my water or eat the food I had brought in front of the healthcare workers because they had gone so many days without," end of quote, without food, without water. Dr. Nadal Farah from Ohio said, quote, "Malnutrition was widespread. It was common to see patients reminiscent of Nazi concentration camps with skeletal features," end of quote, Dr. Farah. Abira Mohammed, a nurse from Dallas, Texas, said, quote, "Everyone we met showed us pictures of themselves before October. They had all lost 20 to 60 pounds of weight. Most patients and staff looked emaciated and dehydrated," end of quote. Dr. Nareen Ahmad from Philadelphia said, quote, "Every patient I treated had evidence of malnutrition. For example, poor wound healing and rapidly developing infections." Dr. Aman Odeh from Texas said, quote, "Mothers on the maternity ward delivered prematurely because of malnutrition, stress, and infection. Milk production was poor due to lack of hydration and adequate food supply," end of quote. And Dr. Mike Malott from Charleston said, quote, "All of my patients were suffering from malnutrition, 100%, end quote. Madam President, what is important to understand, and I'm not sure that many of my colleagues do, is that the Israel of today that we are dealing with is not the Israel of Golda Meir or Yitzhak Rabin. This is a government now controlled not only by right-wing extremists, but by religious zealots. National Security Minister Ben-Gvir, who oversees the police, has been convicted in Israeli courts on terrorism charges. He's the head of the police. Finance Minister Smotrich, in charge of the occupied West Bank, is also an extreme racist and has called for the expulsion of Palestinians from the land. That is the current Israeli finance minister. Madam President, in January, Prime Minister Netanyahu said of Gaza, and I quote, "We provide minimal humanitarian aid if we want to achieve our war goals," end of quote. At the start of the war, the Israeli defense minister said, and I quote, and I hope people hear this, Israeli defense minister, ex-minister, quote, "We are fighting human animals, and we act accordingly. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel, everything is closed," end quote, former Israeli defense minister. That is what he said, and in fact, by and large, that is exactly how this war has been waged. Madam President, what this extremist government has done in Gaza is unspeakable. But what makes it even more painful is that much of this has been done with U.S. weapons and American taxpayer dollars. In the last year alone, the U.S. has provided $18 billion in military aid to Israel. $18 billion. And by the way, a few blocks from here, people are sleeping out on the street. And we have also delivered more than 50,000 tons of military equipment to Israel, 50,000 tons. In other words, Madam President, the United States of America is complicit in all of these atrocities. We are funding these atrocities. That complicity must end, and that is what these resolutions are about. It is time to tell the Netanyahu government that they cannot use U.S. taxpayer dollars and American weapons in violation of U.S. and international law and our moral values. Despite receiving $18 billion from U.S. taxpayers in the last year and being the largest historical recipient of U.S. foreign aid, the Netanyahu government has completely ignored the repeated requests of President Biden and the U.S. government. It is time to make clear to Netanyahu that he cannot take American money, take American arms, and continue to undermine U.S. foreign policy goals. The U.S. government wants a ceasefire for hostage deal. Netanyahu has prevented a deal to preserve his coalition. The U.S. government wants more humanitarian aid to reach the desperate people in Gaza. Netanyahu is blocking that aid. The U.S. government wants to contain regional escalation. Netanyahu has refused diplomatic off-ramps and launched several reckless attacks without consulting the United States. The United States government wants to stop settlement expansion and settle violence in the West Bank. Netanyahu and his ministers have driven record settlement expansion and armed extremist settlers. The U.S. government wants a plan for post-war governance in Gaza, yet Netanyahu will not engage. And by the way, blocking these sales would also be in keeping with actions taken by some of our closest allies. The United Kingdom suspended 30 arms export licenses after concluding there was an unacceptable risk they could be used in violation of international law. Germany, Italy, Spain, Canada, Belgium, and the Netherlands have taken similar steps. UN bodies have called for an end to the arms shipments fueling the conflict. Madam President, time and time again, I've heard members of the U.S. Senate come to this floor to denounce human rights violations taking place around the world. I've heard well-founded concerns about China's brutal reception of the Uyghur ethnic minority. I've heard rightful outrage about Putin's brutal attacks against Ukraine and bombing of civilian installations. I've heard genuine concern about Iran's outrageous crackdown on peaceful protesters. I've heard repeated condemnations of Saudi Arabia's terrible treatment of women and political dissidents. And on it goes. A lot of folks come to the floor to talk about human rights. and what's going on throughout the world. But what I want to say to all those folks, nobody is going to take anything you say with a grain of seriousness. You cannot condemn human rights around the world and then turn a blind eye to what the United States government is now funding in Israel. People will laugh in your face. They will say to you, you're concerned about China, you're concerned about Russia, you're concerned about Iran. Well, why are you funding the starvation of children in Gaza right now? So, Madam President, we must pass these resolutions from a legal perspective. The U.S. government must obey the law. We must pass these resolutions from a moral perspective. The United States must not provide support to a government which has created one of the worst humanitarian disasters in modern history. We must pass these resolutions for our own best foreign policy interests. If we do not demand that the countries we provide military assistance to obey international law, we will lose our credibility on the world stage. And with that, Madam President, I would like to yield to Senator Merkley of Oregon.
Madam President.
Senator from Oregon.
Madam President, in 1978, between my junior and senior years in college, I hitchhiked through Israel and the West Bank. I made Israeli friends. I was invited to stay at a kibbutz. I explored the old city of Jerusalem. I negotiated the ancient tunnel built by King Hezekiah in the face of advancing armies. I climbed the snake path to the top of Masada. I swam in the Sea of Galilee and in the Red Sea and the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. I was so impressed by the energy for building a new nation, for planting forests, for making the desert bloom with new irrigation systems, constructing cities and roads. And in addition, peace was on the horizon. 9 months before my visit in November 1977, Anwar Sadat had visited Jerusalem to address the Knesset and pursue a path to peace. And then just weeks after I left, he was shaking hands with Menachem Begin and Jimmy Carter at Camp David, and a peace treaty signed the following year in March. I was all in on America standing in partnership with this new nation, perched on a little sliver of land surrounded by hostile neighbors. And I have voted here in the Senate time and again for economic support for Israel, for military support for Israel. I have believed in the vision that it was the right way to help Israel thrive, the best path to peace and security. If many of us reasoned, if Israel's economy was thriving, their military strength ensured their security, they could with confidence negotiate a secure and peaceful future with their neighbors. They could with confidence negotiate parameters for a Palestinian state so the Palestinians could thrive as well. Not so long ago, just over a decade, I traveled to Israel with former Senators Mark Begich of Alaska and Kay Hagan of North Carolina, and we met around a little table with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And at that time, now 12 years ago, he expounded eloquently on his thesis that the only path for Israel's peace and prosperity was 2 states for 2 people. In the dozen years since, much has changed. Prime Minister Netanyahu has become a public and vocal opponent of a Palestinian state. Israel has engaged in the de facto annexation of the West Bank, land essential for a Palestinian state. They've done this through settlements. They've done this through legalizing outposts. They have created innumerable checkpoints. They have created settler-only roads. In addition, Netanyahu has formed his government now with Bezalel Smotrich as Minister of Finance, someone who said the Palestinian people do not exist and called for a Palestinian town to be erased. And Itamar Ben-Gvir, Minister of National Security, who celebrated Baruch Goldstein's slaughter of 29 Palestinians at the cave of Patriot's massacre in 1994. Today, the policies of the Netanyahu government are very different than the policies 12 years before. Under this government, attacks by Israel's West Bank settlers against Palestinian villages have become more frequent, more violent, and often condoned by the Israeli Defense Forces. Events on October 7th, a year ago, took a terrible turn. Hamas terrorists attacked Israeli communities. They slaughtered 1,200 Israeli men, women, and children. They abducted 240 hostages. And the whole world was with Israel. We recalled 9/11. We grieved with Israel. We grieved with the Jewish communities in our home state. And we defended Israel's right to respond with a campaign targeted at destroying Hamas. But I'm here on the floor today because the way a war is conducted matters. And Israel's bombing campaign, described by President Biden as indiscriminate, has reduced Gaza to rubble and ruin. It has destroyed most of the infrastructure needed for survival: schools, hospitals, homes, the power system, the communications phone system, the internet system, the water system, the transportation system. Most significantly, the bombing campaign has killed tens of thousands of women, children, and seniors. It has seriously injured more than 100,000 more Palestinians living in Gaza. And Israel has chosen to restrict humanitarian aid. The consequences of that are that food and clean water are woefully short, medical supplies are minimal, and the specter of starvation haunts Gaza. The indiscriminate bombing and the obstruction of humanitarian aid violate the laws of war. Now, President Biden and his team have consistently pressed the Netanyahu government to change tracks. They recognize that it's difficult in the setting in Gaza where Hamas embeds itself, but even so have argued to Israel that the campaign against Hamas could be much more targeted, with far fewer civilian casualties. But the Netanyahu government has rejected this appeal. And Biden and his team have pushed to open the gates to Gaza, have Israel open the gates to Gaza, and to massively increase humanitarian aid. And again, the Netanyahu government has rejected this appeal. In mid-October, just last month, Secretary of State Blinken and Secretary of Defense Austin renewed their appeal. They warned the Netanyahu government that they must increase the amount of humanitarian aid within 30 days to comply with U.S. law. And they wrote in that letter, the amount of assistance entering Gaza in September was the lowest of any month in the last year. They laid out in this letter a whole series of horrific conditions that needed to be addressed, just as they had argued for the same for the previous year. The result of that has simply been minimal to no action. In November, a major evaluation was summarized in a letter by the principals of the Interagency Standing Committee. These are groups like the High Commissioner for Human Rights and Oxfam and UNICEF and the World Food Program, headed by Cindy McCain, and the World Health Organization. These leaders who have folks on the ground, who have lots of experts evaluating the situation, they recognized this. They summarized it: the situation unfolding in North Gaza is apocalyptic. And they go on to talk about the schools serving as shelters having been bombed, about rescue teams being deliberately attacked, and more. As I described at the start of my remarks, I have, since my first trip to Israel in 1978, been all in on the special partnership between the U.S. and Israel. on economic support, on security support, in the belief that our partnership would maximize Israel's confidence in pursuing peace and security. But the actions of the last decade have shattered that analysis. The Netanyahu government is systematically undermining the possibility of a Palestinian state through its settlement checkpoints, its outposts, its settler-only highways. It is conducting its war campaign in Gaza in a fashion that is producing massive civilian deaths and injuries, conditions that aid organizations consistently describe as the worst they've seen anywhere in the world. I believe that not only is this horrific for the Palestinians, but this is absolutely not in the best interest of Israel's future. The actions of the Netanyahu government are burning through a massive reservoir of goodwill that was overflowing after October 7th. It is undoing the improved relationships with Arab neighbors won through the Abraham Accords. It is damaging because of our connection to Israel through military arms, our advocacy and legitimacy, campaigning for human rights around the world. So I ask you, what do you do when a good friend, a partner, heads off on a disastrous course? President Biden and his team responded by providing proposals and encouragement to get back on course, but those were rejected. So now we must weigh in here in this chamber. And many in this chamber may say, let's just continue the past. Let's not see the horrific circumstances in Gaza. Let's not observe the systematic takeover of the West Bank. Let's ignore all that and continue with this very different right-wing government without ever raising an eyebrow. I disagree. I think that true partners do not stand idly by when their partners go way off track in destructive ways. And thus that we should not continue to provide the munitions that we are voting on today. We cannot remain silent in the face of Netanyahu's strategy. We must not continue to provide offensive weapons that make the United States complicit in the deaths of tens of thousands of Palestinians, the injury of 100,000 more innocents. Thus, I will choose to honor American law and respect international law and support Israel's best long-term interest to thrive by voting to block these 3 weapon transfers up for consideration today. I was fabulously impressed by Israel when I hitchhiked around the country in 1978, impressed by the can-do spirit, impressed by the future of a peace with Egypt and a possibility of peace with every neighbor. I look forward to seeing that vision of peace and security realized, and my vote today supports that vision. Thank you.
President.
Senator from Nevada.
Thank you, Madam President. Since Hamas launched the deadliest terrorist attack in Israel's history more than a year ago, Israel has consistently faced a barrage of threats from Iran and its terrorist proxies. Earlier this year, we all saw how Iran launched 2 separate missile and drone attacks directly at Israel. And just this week, Israelis were wounded and killed after Hezbollah launched more rockets at northern Israel. And the resolutions we are debating today would not only hurt Israel's ability to defend itself against these attacks, they would embolden Iran. I will repeat, they will embolden Iran and its terrorist proxies to continue and even increase their vicious and deadly attacks. In doing so, they could prolong this war even further at a time when we are close to securing a deal in Lebanon. I know some on my side of the aisle are going to support these resolutions because they disagree with the current Israeli government. But your decision whether or not to help Israel defend itself and cannot be a political one. Government leaders and politicians, well, they come and go, but our commitment to Israel's security must be ironclad. and restricting much-needed arms to Israel because you don't agree with everything the current government is doing will leave our ally vulnerable to future terror. I'll repeat, governments and leaders come and go. Will our support for our ally remain? Israel has an absolute right to defend itself, and the aid provided by America is critical. I know some of you are planning to vote for these resolutions agree, but you may be worried about the need for these offensive weapons that the resolutions would block, so let me explain. Israel cannot rely on missile defense alone to protect its citizens. It also needs to have the ability to destroy enemy threats before they can be deployed and to respond to attacks that have already been launched. It's this strategy that Israel successfully executed over the last few months in Lebanon, where it has preemptively destroyed Hezbollah rocket launchers just minutes, moments before they were set to fire on Israel. And by providing Israel with these weapons, which are more precise and more accurate, we can actually help it defend itself while also minimizing civilian casualties. I know many of you here are torn. You want to do the right thing. And I'm here to tell you that voting against these resolutions is the right thing. Banning the sale of arms will hurt Israel. It'll send the wrong message to Iran and its terrorist proxies that America is abandoning its ally and that terrorists can now act with impunity. Let me repeat. The message to terrorists will be, again, that they can continue to act with impunity. Terrorists like Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, and others will continue to receive that message loud and clear, and I can promise you that they will plan accordingly. So if we're serious about preventing another atrocity like October 7th, if we're serious about limiting civilian casualties, if we're serious about sending a message to terrorists around the globe, I urge all of you to vote no on all three resolutions. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
Senator from Idaho.
Madam President, I rise in opposition to the resolutions that we have before us. For 76 years, and by the way, I agree and associate myself with remarks from my friend colleague from Nevada, and not so much with my colleagues from Vermont and Oregon. I respect them individually. I am in opposition to these resolutions before us, and I want to speak for a few minutes as to why. For 76 years, the United States has stood with the State of Israel, our strongest ally in the Middle East. But today, members of this body are sending a message that United States support for Israel is in question. It is not. This comes after a difficult year during which this administration has egregiously undermined Israel's ability to defend itself as it fights a several-front war against Iran and our common enemies. The administration has withheld weapons and ammunition, has issued National Security Memorandum 20, which has held Israel to arbitrary standards and interfered in Israel's domestic politics, all in an effort to placate the far left of the Democratic Party during our own domestic elections. Today, instead of acknowledging that American support for Israel is still strong, these resolutions seek to say that support for Israel has changed. It has not. I know these resolutions will fail, and I hope the world will hear me when I say that the people of America support Israel, full stop. But I think it's important to remember how we got here. This administration foolishly thought we could get along with Iran and beg the Iranians to talk. When the Iranians refused, the administration released billions of dollars in frozen assets in an effort to buy the Iranians off. Meanwhile, the administration reversed U.S. sanctions policies that had cut off the flow of money to the Iranians. The Iranian Ghost Fleet, which Tehran uses to evade sanctions, grew from under 80 ghost ships moving oil to now over 300 ships. Awash with money and knowing the administration would not challenge Iranian bad behavior, Iran knew it could start this war in Gaza without consequences. Rather than focus on Iran's behavior, these resolutions before us today are the predictable evolution of the administration's horrible and failed policies that seek to both appease critics of Israel and isolate the Jewish state in the international community at a time of its greatest need. The departure from the regular process for moving arms sales and the administration's repeated threats to halt assistance to Israel invited these resolutions that are now before us. Withholding arms sales signals to the terrorists that American support for Israel is conditional and encourages Iran's proxies to extend the war in Gaza, further risking civilians, and incentivizes Hezbollah to continue its attacks on Israel from the north. We must stand with Israel as it confronts these threats. Voting in favor of these resolutions would have significant foreign policy implications far beyond the Middle East. U.S. allies across the globe will lose confidence in the U.S. as a dependable security partner. Partners straddling the fence between the United States on the one hand and China and Russia on the other are watching this and watching closely. They will certainly draw the conclusion that the United States is a fickle friend and cannot be relied upon to follow through on its commitments in the hour of their greatest need. To make it worse, these resolutions highlight that instead of confronting our adversaries and their bad actions, the U.S. will instead call on our friends to simply take it and to threaten them if they do not just take it. Support for Israel has traditionally enjoyed broad bipartisan support. I know that is true today. As such, I ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote no on these resolutions and to deliver a strong voice of support for Israel. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Much. I appreciate it. I want to show my support for what my colleague just said, Senator Risch. It made perfect sense. And this is a consequential vote. We all know how it's going to end. But let me tell you why it's consequential. A lot of people are watching what we're doing here today, and they're trying to get a signal, understand like where we're all coming from. Let me tell you where I'm coming from. I'm coming from the idea that if you want to end the war between Israel and the Palestinians, we need to replace Hamas with somebody who doesn't want to kill all the Jews. Hamas attacked Israel on October the 7th, killing more Jews than any time since the Holocaust. What were they up to? Their pledge to destroy the Jewish state, they're religious Nazis. If you don't believe me, listen to what they've said. It was barbaric. They slaughtered entire families. They decapitated children's heads. They raped women in front of their own family. And they filmed it to create hard hearts throughout the world and the region. The Nazis hid their crimes. Hamas filmed it so you could see it. Why? October the 7th, in large part, not completely, was designed to stop efforts to have Saudi Arabia and Israel recognize each other and virtually end the Arab-Israeli conflict. I've been to the region 7 or 8 times since October the 7th. I went with a group of 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats right after October the 7th to deliver 2 messages. Went to Saudi Arabia, the biggest power in the Islamic world, and I went to Israel. And to our friends in Israel, I said, we will give you at least from my view, the ability to make sure there is no second Holocaust. And the weapons we provided to Israel has resulted in the destruction of Hamas. There is no way forward for the Palestinians until you reform the PA, which is run by a bunch of corrupt old guys, and make sure Hamas never comes back. The most radicalized population on the planet are young people in Gaza. From the time they're born to the time they die, they're taught to hate and kill the Jews. Look at their education system. How do we change that? Somebody other than Israel has to come in and take over Gaza and reform the West Bank to give the Palestinians a better life. It will not be the United States. We can't do that. It's certainly not going to be Israel. Well, who would it be? It'd be the Arab world. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has a vision for his country and the region that I buy into. We've had our problems in the past for sure. But women can drive, which is a big thing, even though it doesn't sound like it. Women can go out to dinner without a male escort. Doesn't sound like a big thing, but it really is. 38% of the people working in Saudi Arabia are young women. So he has a vision to change his country and to build on the Abraham Accords. President Trump and his team was able to get 6 Arab nations to recognize Israel, the United Arab Emirates and others, which was a huge deal. And we have a chance to build on it. So for the last 2.5 years, I've been going over to Saudi Arabia and Israel, working with the Biden administration to try to build out the Abraham Accords. And the big prize would be have Saudi Arabia make peace with Israel, take over Gaza and the West Bank with other people in the region, and give the Palestinians a better life, rebuild Gaza, create honest government to replace corrupt government, give them sovereignty, self-government, the ability to live dignified lives, and to give Israel security. October the 7th was designed by Hamas to stop what was imminent. I'm here to tell you that in October, before October the 6th, by the way, there were discussions about how to roll out the normalization deal. Along comes October the 7th. Ever since that day, we've been dealing with this horrible situation. The rape and torture and destruction of 1,200 Jewish people, the response by Israel that's resulted in thousands of people being killed, a lot of terrorists, but a lot of children, a lot of innocent people. There are a lot of photos being presented. I want to introduce 2 photos. Unanimous consent, if I may. This is a photo of Hiroshima. 2 photos, actually. This is what happens when you drop a nuclear weapon on people. It's not good. Now, why did we do that? After Pearl Harbor, we and the civilized world went to war against the Nazis and Imperial Japan. Millions of people lost their lives. But it was the goal of the United States to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and we're able to do that. Out of the ashes of that terrible, horrible war, we now have 2 democracies. Japan and Germany are good allies of the United States. They're productive members of the international community. It took a generation plus to change the radicalization of the German population through the Nazis, and the same in Imperial Japan. What will happen is if we can find normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, there will be hope for the Palestinians I have not seen before. Those who want a 2-state solution, we've got to sit down and talk about how you do that after October the 7th. But I do believe without resolving the Palestinian issue where the Palestinian people have a hopeful life versus a glorious death, we'll never move forward. I really do believe after October the 7th, Israel needs security more than ever. What's the key? The Arabs. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, MBZ, and the United Arab Emirates, I think, hold the key to this. If we could create a political horizon over the arc of time for the Palestinians that you will have self-governance, that you'll be independent, and convince the Israelis that this new entity will not threaten you, there can never be another October the 7th, then we're well on our way to a new region. This resolution today, no matter how sincere, undercuts all this. Israel has had to respond to an attack that was the most vicious since World War II against the Jewish people. I blame Hamas more than any other group about the loss of life in Gaza because they used their own people as human shields. This commitment of the United States to give Israel what they need to win a war they can't afford to lose has to be uncompromising. But what's not uncompromising is the day after. We're getting to the point now that with the destruction of Hamas, we've got to think about how can we prevent them from coming back. Israel cannot occupy Gaza. The West Bank needs to be reformed, but it has to be done with the Arab world leading the charge. So what I'd like to do with President Biden before he leaves office is work with President Trump, the incoming president, and President Biden, the outgoing president, to find a solution. Can we lock down a normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel that protects Saudi Arabia, a defense agreement with the United States, so they'll be in our column and they will have an antidote to Iranian aggression? And can we, as a part of that, create a political horizon for the Palestinians to have hope where there is despair? Yes, we can. But now's not the time to send this signal. This signal will be seen by the enemies of Israel and the enemies of peace as if they just stick with it, they will win. If you want peace, you have to destroy those who hate peace. This is not a Bibi problem. This is a problem where their Islamic terrorists, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, want to kill all the Jews, not just Bibi. Now, why do they want to do that? They're religious Nazis. I don't know why Hitler wanted to kill all the Jews, but he did. So the Ayatollah has a couple things in mind. The purification of Islam, which means that Sunni Islam will bend to his will. If you don't believe me, ask the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. The other goal is to destroy the Jewish state and to drive us out of the Mideast. The religious doctrine of the Shiites in charge compel them to kill all the Jews. It's a commandment from God. Here's what I know. That's not what Islam teaches most Muslims, but they believe it. And when we ignored Hitler, we did so not only at our own peril, but the peril of millions of people. What have I learned from history? When someone threatens to kill you because you're of a particular race or religion, you should take that seriously. So how do we end this conflict? We end this conflict with the complete decimation of Hamas, a plan for the day after that will replace Hamas in Gaza, reform the PA, try to get a ceasefire in Lebanon, and reduce the impact that Hezbollah has on the Lebanese people. All of the Shiite, Iranian-backed militia have as their goal disruption, upheaval, and tyranny. They want to control the region and remake it in their own image. Look what they're doing in Syria, look what they're doing in Yemen, look what they're doing in Lebanon. We have a historic opportunity here to give Israel what they need to finish the war they can't afford to lose, come up with a day-after plan that would replace Hamas with a better life, try to get Lebanon in a better space, and build on the Abraham Accords. This effort by my colleagues undercuts all that. You have every right to say anything you want to say in this body, but I've been there a lot, and none of you have gone with me. Making peace is hard. We haven't done this together. I've been with Senator Van Hollen to Israel. I've been to Senator Van Hollen before in the region. I think he wants to help the Palestinians, and I don't think he's anti-Semitic. I just think there's an opportunity here, and it's not about Bibi, folks. It's about a strain of Islam that will kill every Jew, including Bibi, and come after us unless they're defeated. So my goal is not only to reject this idea, but to work with President Biden and President Trump and their teams before the next president takes office, to have a day-after plan that will allow Israel to withdraw, and there'll be no more October 7th, and allow Gaza and the West Bank to be rebuilt with dignity and hope. That is my goal. This resolution undercuts my goal. I would urge you to vote no. And I will be going back next week to Saudi Arabia. And I'm going to keep working with the Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration to the last hour, to the last minute of the last day to find a solution. And I would end with this. If we fail to find a day after plan that allows Israel to withdraw and be secure, and fails to deliver a political horizon for the Palestinians, God help us all. This will repeat itself. Iran will come back. Hezbollah and Hamas will reemerge. We have a moment in time to change the region and change the world, and I would ask all of us to seize that moment, and this resolution is counter to what I'm trying to achieve. So I would urge a no vote, because peace and a dignified life for the Palestinians rest with a viable day after plan. And what is the proper response to people who want to kill you and your family and destroy your way of life? I can tell you what the United States did. We went to war. We dropped 2 atomic bombs to end a war we couldn't afford to lose. What is the right response to those who want to kill all the Jews? Make sure they don't have the capability to do it. Thank you. Yield.
Madam President.
Senator from Maryland.
Madam President, I rise in support of the joint resolutions of disapproval that the Senate is considering today on the sales of certain offensive weapons to the Netanyahu government. And to be clear, I do not support an arms embargo on Israel. But I do believe that the United States should pause the delivery of offensive weapons until the Netanyahu government meets the requirements of U.S. law and policy with respect to the delivery of humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza and the use of American weapons there. So this is not about abandoning support for Israel. This is about making sure American support for Israel complies with American laws and policies and values. We would not be on this floor considering these resolutions if that was happening today. And these votes will be the one opportunity that members of the Senate have to send that message. And I urge my colleagues to support them. Following the Hamas attacks of October 7th, I have, as probably every senator has, supported Israel's right to defend itself, in fact, argued that they have a duty to defend themselves and end Hamas's control of Gaza, and I am steadfast in that support to this moment. There must be no more October 7th. At the same time, U.S. taxpayer-funded assistance should not come in the form of a blank check, even to our closest allies. We need to ensure that U.S. interests, values, and priorities will be respected by foreign governments that receive U.S. assistance. That is why our security assistance to many countries includes various conditions to encourage progress on human rights. In some cases, as in the case of Ukraine, we have limited the use of certain systems to align with U.S. national security interests. In other cases, including even some NATO allies, we have prevented the transfer of certain advanced weapon systems when our policy goals do not align. The one minimum standard that we must apply to all recipients of American security assistance is compliance with American laws. And it is compliance with that minimum standard that we're talking about here today. Nothing more, nothing less. And the Netanyahu government should not be exempt from that universal requirement of American law. the United States has provided billions and billions of dollars of American taxpayer-financed bombs and other offensive weapon systems, but we've seen Prime Minister Netanyahu repeatedly violate the terms of American security assistance, disregard U.S. priorities, and ignore our requests, only to be rewarded by more bombs and more money. That pattern undermines the credibility of the United States around the world and creates an unacceptable double standard that our adversaries are exploiting. Two of the conditions that every recipient of U.S. security assistance must meet are: one, they must facilitate and not arbitrarily restrict the delivery of humanitarian assistance into war zones where those U.S. weapons are being used, war zones like Ukraine and war zones like Gaza. And two, they must use American-supplied weapons in accordance with international humanitarian law, which was well developed after World War II, and what Senator Graham spoke to. The Netanyahu government is violating both of these requirements in Gaza. And by refusing to take action, the President and the United States are complicit in those violations of American laws and American values. Let's look at the unacceptable restrictions being placed by the Netanyahu government on the delivery of humanitarian aid to desperately needed civilians in Gaza right now. It has been well documented that there was some improvement in the delivery of humanitarian supplies in Gaza last April, around the time that the Biden administration had to submit the NSM-20 report to Congress. But since then, aid levels have been on a downhill slide and then a precipitous drop. And the cumulative impact of severe restrictions on the delivery of humanitarian aid has worsened an already catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza, and Senator Sanders spoke to the conditions there. In fact, that's why President Biden directly called on Prime Minister Netanyahu to increase aid to Gaza on many occasions, most recently in an early October call. And that's why on October 13th, Secretaries Austin and Blinken expressly reminded Israeli government officials in a letter that I have here of their obligations under U.S. and international law. They specifically cited Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act and National Security Memorandum 20 to facilitate and not arbitrarily restrict the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Here's what our two secretaries wrote in that letter. Quote, "We are particularly concerned that recent actions by the Israeli government, including halting commercial imports, denying or impeding nearly 90% of humanitarian movements between northern and southern Gaza in September," and then they go on to list a number of other things, are, quote, "contributing to an accelerated deterioration of the condition in Gaza." And then Secretaries Austin and Blinken laid out a series of key measures against which they said the United States was going to measure the Netanyahu government's compliance. They mentioned enabling a minimum of 350 trucks per day to enter Gaza. They mentioned instituting adequate humanitarian pauses across Gaza to enable humanitarian activities. They said they mentioned reinstating a minimum of 50 to 100 commercial trucks per day. They had a long list of items. So what do 8 very respected international NGOs that conduct humanitarian relief in Gaza and monitor it have to say about whether those conditions were met? Well, they've compiled a scorecard. I've got it right here. And what they say on the specific items I mentioned was that the Netanyahu government failed. In fact, the overall report card concludes Israel fails to comply with U.S. humanitarian access demands in Gaza. In fact, they determined that not only did the Netanyahu government, quote, fail to meet U.S. criteria that would indicate support to the humanitarian response, but concurrently took actions that dramatically worsened the conditions on the ground, particularly in northern Gaza. They said the situation is even more dire today than a month ago. In other words, because of those actions that were taken, the situation was worse than when Secretary Austin and Blinken sent their letter. Indeed, an independent Washington Post analysis found that, quote, Israel has largely failed to comply with the 3 demands of the U.S. letter, unquote. In that November 12th Washington Post article, they also pointed out the following, and I quote, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has refused to publicly disavow the plan which calls for the military to take control of the north by starving the civilian population and treating everyone who remains as combatants, unquote. The story goes on to say, and I quote, the IDF says it has been given no such orders and is focused on dismantling Hamas, but the ongoing military operation in the north appears to have much in common with the strategy, unquote. It's called the general's strategy. A leading Israeli newspaper, Haaretz, editorialized with the following headline, Netanyahu's ethnic cleansing in Gaza is on display for all to see, unquote. That is a view that's also been echoed by many Israeli human rights organizations, and I commend them on all the work that they do every day. And I find it extraordinary that so many of our colleagues come to this floor to talk about human rights abuses across the world. They cite Human Rights Watch, they cite Amnesty International, but when it comes to those organizations writing reports about human rights violations conducted by the Netanyahu government, oh no, they run away from that. So let's look at what others have said in terms of monitoring the situation right now in Gaza. On November 1st, the principals of the Interagency Standing Committee, the leaders of 15 UN and humanitarian organizations, including the World Food Program, Executive Director Cindy McCain, and UNICEF Director Catherine Russell, 2 American leaders of those organizations, said, and I quote, the situation in northern Gaza is apocalyptic, unquote. And they say, quote, the entire Palestinian population in North Gaza is at imminent risk of dying from disease, famine, and violence. Humanitarians are not safe to do their work and are blocked by Israeli forces and insecurity from reaching people in need, unquote. They say, quote, rescue teams have been deliberately attacked and thwarted in their attempts to pull people buried under the rubble of their homes, unquote. And yet, we keep sending more bombs. In that statement, the UN and humanitarian leaders also issued this call, quote, member states must use their leverage to ensure respect for international law. That includes withholding arms transfers where there is a clear risk that such arms will be used in violation of international law, unquote. So let's look at the use of American weapons. In its May 20th NSM 20 report to Congress, the Biden administration concluded, and I quote, it's reasonable to assess that defense articles covered under NSM 20 have been used by Israeli security forces since October 7th in instances inconsistent with international humanitarian law obligations or with established best practices for mitigating civilian harm. And in that report, and I urge my colleagues to look at it, the administration identified a sampling of cases of civilian harm incidents where U.S. weapons were used, and they said there's some ongoing investigations, and we're still waiting for answers from the Netanyahu government. Well, just a few weeks ago, there was a report that we now have 500 cases of civilian harm where U.S. weapons were used under review. And if you look at the most recent letter from Secretaries Blinken and Austin, you will see that they reference at the bottom of their report the following. And I want to read this because their letter says, quote, lastly, it is crucial that our governments establish a new channel to raise and discuss incidents of civilian harm. Our previous engagements have not achieved the necessary outcomes. We request the initial virtual meeting for this channel to be held by the end of October. This is more than a year into the war. And here you have the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State saying they're not getting enough information from the Netanyahu government. to be able to make decisions about whether or not U.S. weapons have been used in violation of international humanitarian law. And yet, despite not getting that information, the administrations continue to send those taxpayer-financed offensive weapons. And it's very clear that the Netanyahu government continues to conduct operations in Gaza in a way that results in large numbers of civilian casualties. And I think our colleagues know that the fact that Hamas violates international law and does despicable tactics by operating from amongst civilians does not absolve Israel or any other country involved in that kind of situation of the duty to avoid civilian harm and avoid the destruction of civilian infrastructure. Since President Biden's recent call with Prime Minister Netanyahu last month, we have seen continued high rates of civilian deaths, and human rights organizations continue to document cases of weapons being used in violation of international humanitarian law. Now, Madam President, that October 13th letter not only warned the Netanyahu government about unacceptable restrictions on humanitarian aid in Gaza, and not only warned them about illegal use of American weapons, they also raised two other issues. One, they said that Israel is required by international law to allow the International Committee of the Red Cross access to Palestinian prisoners who were detained without any charges. And yet, despite them sending the letter, no change there. And that means over 3,000 Palestinian prisoners who have been in prison without charge under administrative detention are not, the ICRC does not have access to them. They also warned in their letter about pending legislation before the Knesset that would cripple UNRWA. And here's what Secretaries Austin and Blinken said. They warned that, quote, enactment of such restrictions would devastate the Gaza humanitarian response at this critical moment and deny vital education and social services to tens of thousands of Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which could have implications under relevant U.S. law and policy, unquote. Within days of the United States government sending that letter, two bills were passed by the Knesset to ban UNRWA. So what we see, Madam President, is a continuing pattern. President Biden makes certain demands that are routinely ignored without consequence. In fact, they're rewarded. And this is an ineffective use of American leverage to accomplish our policy goals and ensure that American law is abided by. I want to just mention a couple others, and Senator Sanders referenced them. But we know that Prime Minister Netanyahu has repeatedly obstructed President Biden's plan for a ceasefire and the return of hostages. Both in Washington and Israel, I've met with families of hostages who are experiencing unthinkable pain. I just met with the father of a soldier who is being held right now in Gaza as hostage. They have stressed that Prime Minister Netanyahu has repeatedly obstructed President Biden's plan to bring home their loved ones. In fact, in his farewell address just 2 weeks ago, former Israeli Defense Minister Gallant noted that one of the key disagreements leading to his firing by Netanyahu was over, quote, our moral obligation and responsibility to bring our kidnapped sons and daughters back home as quickly as possible, with as many alive as possible to their families. He went on to say, based on my role, experience, and the military achievements of the past year, with a clear-eyed view of reality, I state that this is an achievable but involves painful compromises that Israel can bear and that the IDF can deal with. This is and will not be any atonement. There is and will not be any atonement for abandoning the captives. This is former Defense Minister Gallant, fired by Netanyahu. I heard Senator Graham speak a lot about the day-after plan. Well, President Biden has proposed a day-after plan. It's to have a reformed Palestinian Authority form the nucleus of governance in Gaza. And indeed, the Netanyahu government, led by Smotrich, not only opposes President Biden's plan, but they have worked to systematically weaken the PA by withholding tax revenues that it collects on behalf of the Palestinian people. What's more, Prime Minister Netanyahu publicly rebuked President Biden's call to create a path to a two-state solution, even bragging that he had long blocked that outcome, something I heard Senator Graham refer to something that was needed. So the Netanyahu government has refused to comply with other requests as well, trying to change rules of engagement on the West Bank in order to prevent the killing of innocent civilians, including the deaths of some American citizens. And contrary to longstanding policy in American governments, Republicans and Democrats alike, about not having expanded settlements in the West Bank, something Secretary Blinken said agreed was inconsistent with international law, we've seen a record number of settlements forwarded by the Netanyahu government. In fact, one when Secretary Blinken was there in Israel. So, Madam President, the issue here is not whether or not the United States is supporting Israel. The issue is whether or not, as we provide that support, we have a two-way street. A partnership should be a two-way street, not a one-way blank check. And at a minimum, the Netanyahu government should comply with American law, as we've talked about today. And when they're not, we have an obligation to the American people and American taxpayers to make sure that we withhold that support until Netanyahu comes into compliance. That's what we're saying here. Just meet the requirements of American law. And all of us have an obligation to American taxpayers to make sure that we are not complicit in violating American law, and American values. So, Madam President, that's why I encourage my colleagues to support these joint resolutions, to send that message. This is the one opportunity we have to do so. And I yield back.
Senator from Vermont.
I decide.
Without objection.
Madam President,
Senator from North Carolina.
I rise today to voice my strong opinion to Senator Sanders' attempt to cut off United States military support to our friend and ally Israel. Now, I don't dare denigrate my colleagues' intent here or the motives, but I believe the effect is reckless, and I believe it's dangerous. And I believe it will lead to the loss of even more lives. We need to remember some basic facts about the difference between the two sides of the conflict here. Israel is Middle East's only democracy. They've been a force for stability in the region that is historically beset by chaos. They've been America's strongest friend in good times and bad. Israel is an unmistakable force for good. And then you have the terrorists of Hamas. I mean, even their founding charter, it calls for the destruction of the state of Israel. Hamas's largest benefactor, Iran, it lends its material and financial support to this cause each and every day. They intentionally target civilians. They target civilians. They fire rockets into crowded markets. And they preach not just death to Israel and to the Jewish people, but death to America. And then came October 7th. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas terrorists launched an unprovoked and deceitful series of terrorist attacks inside Israel. The level of barbarism that we witnessed was nothing short of evil incarnate. The mass slaughter of innocent civilians, unmistakable and unspeakable violence against women, children, and the elderly. It was the deadliest massacre of the Jewish people since the Holocaust. These crimes against humanity were also visited upon American citizens as well. Hamas murdered 46 Americans. They kidnapped 12. 7 U.S. hostages, 7 U.S. citizens remain hostage in Gaza. The state of Israel has every right to root out the genocidal terrorists who committed these acts and eliminate the threat once and for all. Israel is carrying out this military action with precision, thanks in part to munitions from the United States. For example, one of the systems that we sell to the Israelis is tail kits with GPS receivers. These kits convert guided or unguided free fall bombs instead into precision guided bombs. Put simply, these kits turn dumb bombs into smart bombs. But Senator Sanders' proposals blocking the sale of these systems to the Israelis, and apparently Senator Sanders would prefer that Israelis use less accurate weapons to eliminate terrorists. Now, it doesn't take anything more than common sense to realize that this would make collateral damage even more likely. In Senator Sanders' zeal to undermine our ally, he would make it more likely that Palestinian civilians who Hamas intentionally uses as human shields, that civilians could be killed. The bottom line is this: cutting off U.S. support for an ally in their time of need is just unbecoming of our country. To hamstring the very nation trying to defeat the perpetrators of the October 7th carnage is insulting to the Americans who were murdered and those who are still held hostage. It's just wrong in every conceivable way. All of these resolutions should be soundly rejected, and this body should stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel as they take the fight to Hamas. I yield the floor.
Madam President,
Majority Leader.
I come to the floor to speak on the resolutions we will be voting on shortly, to share why I strongly oppose them. Israel is surrounded by enemies dedicated to its annihilation, from Hamas to Hezbollah to the Houthis to most threateningly of all, Iran. These threats, sadly, have been around for a long time and will persist for many years into the future. Israel needs to protect itself, not just today, but also tomorrow and next year and beyond. It has been a cornerstone of American policy to give Israel the resources it needs to defend against its enemies. We should not stray from that policy today. Many of the arms sales in question today will not reach Israel until years from now. We have no idea what kind of threats Israel will face by then. It could be an even more emboldened Iran, or a strengthened Hezbollah, or some other threat. There are few, if any, who imagine the barbaric assault perpetrated by Hamas on October the 7th. The twisted and hateful ideology that underpins that violence from places like Iran will sadly continue in the region for some time to come. Israel will need to be fully prepared to face those threats. So voting to block assistance today could well very embolden Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran and endanger Israel's security on into the future. I know there are many in this chamber who have been strongly critical of Prime Minister Netanyahu's policies. I am certainly one of them, as I've made clear right here on the Senate floor, where I clearly stated the urgent need to diligently pursue a two-state solution. I've also made clear that Israel must do more to reduce the suffering of innocent civilians in Gaza and do much more to get humanitarian aid to where it is urgently needed. However, our security assistance to Israel transcends any one prime minister or any one government. This is about Israel's long-term security and honoring a cornerstone of United States policy, that we will give Israel, a democracy and a steadfast ally, the resources it needs to protect itself in a difficult world. There are ways to express criticism and to work on addressing these criticisms without impacting Israel's security. So this is why I will be voting no. Again, while it is perfectly legitimate to objections with the Netanyahu government, and I know many of my colleagues wish to express their disapproval, I believe these resolutions are the wrong way and the wrong strategy to voice those objections. I vote no and urge others to do the same.
Madam President.
From Vermont.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the Majority Leader, not only for his leadership
on this issue in his straightforward, direct embrace of the cause of Israel, but also your openness for a debate in the Senate about what is the best pathway forward. And Madam President, I also want to acknowledge that I had to listen carefully to the words of Senator Schumer, Senator Rosen, Senator Budd. They have given eloquent arguments in favor of opposing this resolution. And they've raised the question that I've had to ask myself. Can I, as a United States Senator, who is a strong supporter of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, can I, as a United States Senator, who is absolutely appalled at what Hamas did on October 7th, can I, as a United States Senator who attended a presentation by the Israeli embassy that displayed the horror of the rapes and the assaults on women who were taken captive, and can I, as a United States Senator who believes in a two-state solution, vote in favor of stopping the delivery of offensive weapons for Israel to use in Gaza? And my answer is yes. And it's for two reasons. First, we're into our 14th month in Gaza. And what has happened is over 43,000 people have been killed. Many Hamas, including the Hamas leadership, has been killed. Good riddance. But many, many thousands of innocent Palestinians, including women and children, have been killed. Over 100,000 have been maimed and injured. 60 to 70% of the structures in Gaza have been destroyed. That includes the schools. Young Gazans have not been in school for 14 months. Hospitals have been destroyed. The humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza is unparalleled, and it's being inflicted on innocent Palestinians. There's a second reason that I am going to support these joint resolutions. I believe the continuation of the military action in Gaza is not only jeopardizing what hostages still are alive, but it can only make Israel weaker, not stronger. Their own recently fired defense minister said there is no further military purpose of offensive action in Gaza. If there is no further reason for offensive military action in Gaza, why is there a need for the United States to be providing more offensive weapons for the Netanyahu government to be used in Gaza? That's the question we face. We talk about the signals that will be sent to Hamas, to Iran, to Israel. There's another reality that can't be escaped, and it isn't answered by inquiring as to what, quote, signals are being sent. It is what is going to happen to these kids, what is going to happen to these families that are continuing to live under bombardment, where they can't be safe anywhere, in part because Hamas will go anywhere they can to try to use them as human shields. But even without that, being told that they can be safe here, but then bombed and being told they can be safe there. Many of these families have been dislocated 6 to 7 times. The humanitarian catastrophe is grinding on. It comes, of course, at a cost, enormous cost to Palestinian families. It's come at a cost to the state of Israel, which we support, with their further isolation in the international community. So, Madam President, the question before us is, what's the right thing to do? Not just by way of limiting and hopefully ending the humanitarian catastrophe, but what is the right thing for the United States to do with its ally Israel in pursuit of the two goals we have always had with Israel, and that is to advocate and defend and support Israel as a democratic, secure Jewish state, and because we believe this is important to make that happen, that we have an independent, secure Palestinian state, a two-state solution. So the question that I have is, will U.S. arms to be used offensively in Gaza at this time and with this government enhance American policy that has been the policy of the United States through Republican and Democratic administrations? And Madam President, the answer I have come to, the judgment I have come to as a United States Senator, is that it would harm our goals for that Jewish democratic state, for the easing of humanitarian suffering, for compliance with international law in the Leahy Law, and for what is the goal that has to be the touchstone of our policy, and that is doing everything we can to achieve a two-state solution for a secure, democratic, independent Israel and a secure, disarmed, not armed, Palestinian state side by side. Madam President, I intend to support these resolutions, and I yield back.
Senator from Louisiana.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the following colleague from my office, Mr. Jamison Sheehan, be granted floor privileges until November 21st, 2024.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Senator Welch is my friend, and he's very eloquent. And I just listened to his eloquent remarks in support of Senator Sanders' resolution. And Senator Sanders is my friend. But he's wrong. He's wrong. Senator Welch talked, as he should have, about the right thing to do. The right thing to do and the smart thing to do is not to pass Senator Sanders' resolution. I don't know why this is, Madam President. If I make it to heaven, I'm going to ask. But there are some people in this world. They're not mixed up. They're not confused. They're not sick. It's not that their mama or daddy didn't love them enough. They're just bad people. And they hurt other people. And they take other people's stuff. Why? Because they can. And some of them are running countries. And they hate America. They hate Americans. They want to kill us and drink our blood out of a boot. That's just a fact. Now, you do not have to be Einstein's cousin to see what's going on in the world. President Xi in China is working with President Putin in Russia, who is working with the Ayatollah in Iran. Sometimes they allow Kim Jong-un from North Korea to come along, but mostly as a mascot to get them coffee. President Xi's running the show, but that doesn't mean that President Putin in Russia, and especially the Ayatollah in Iran, are not right there by his side. And what is their objective? Their objective is to have Russia dominate Central and Eastern Europe. Their objective is to have China dominate the Indo-Pacific, about which I'll speak in a moment, and to have China dominate sub-Saharan Africa, and to have China have the ability to roam free in South America. And their objective is to have Iran, the Ayatollah, dominate the Middle East, which is it has done until Israel decided to fight back, which it has done through Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthi rebels. Now that's just a fact. And one of our best friends in the world, maybe on some days our only friend in the world, Israel. Patient people, principled people, but realistic people. They have decided to stand up to Iran. And in standing up to Iran, we're finding out very quickly they're also standing up to China and Russia. But I'll save that subject for another day. They have decided to stand up to Iran. They have beaten Hamas in Gaza. They're beating Hezbollah in Lebanon. They had to do it despite the obstacles thrown up against them every step of the way by President Biden and Vice President Harris. And if we support them, Israel will beat the Ayatollah in Iran. Israel will cause a regime change. Because I can tell you, the people of Iran, not its leadership, the people of Iran are fed up with their leadership. We have a duty, not a legal duty, a moral duty to support our friend Israel. We've agreed to do it, but beside that, we have a moral duty to do it. And my friend Senator Sanders' resolution would turn our back on one of the few friends that I think America, real friends that America has in the world. And it would precipitate a foreign policy crisis. I don't say these words very often, but we ought to listen to the words of my friend Senator Schumer, who's going to vote against Senator Sanders' resolution. Senator Schumer is right. Even a blind hog finds an acre now and then. Senator Schumer is right. We need to defeat this resolution. It will precipitate a foreign policy crisis. And it's not the only one we would have in the world. I want to talk for just a few minutes about another crisis that's going on quietly as we speak. This is the Indian Ocean, Madam President, as you well know. One of the most important parts of the world. Here's China. Here's India. China's trying to dominate all of these sea lanes for military reasons and for commercial reasons. Here in the middle of the Indian Ocean is a group of islands called the Chagos Islands. You may not have heard of them. I hadn't before I was alerted to this crisis. America has a military base in the Chagos Islands. Chagos Islands, there are about 60 islands, 40 to 60 islands. One of the islands is called Diego Garcia. And we built a military base here. And it is not just any military base. It is an extraordinarily important military base. Our military base is one of the few in the world where our military can reload submarines. Hugely important. Our military base on Diego Garcia in the Chagos Islands, houses a number of Navy ships. Our military base there houses long-range bombers that we use to carry out missions around the world. Now, we in the United Kingdom, I'll explain why the UK is involved in a moment, we have to work hard every day to police our military base, not just the base itself, but the land, or rather the water surrounding it, because China knows how important this military base is to the security of the world. China is constantly sending craft trying to spy on our military base there. And we and the United Kingdom, again, I will mention in a second, explain in a second, the United Kingdom's relevance, are constantly having to patrol and fight off the espionage of China. In fact, China has breached the security of American military bases over 100 times in the last few years. They're very aggressive. Now, why am I talking about this military base? Because President Biden and Vice President Harris, as we're all working here, trying like a bunch of ants in a sugar bowl, trying to wrap up our work for the year, President Biden and Vice President Harris are giving away this military base. They're giving it away. The Chagos Islands is a territory of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom gave America permission to build our military base here. Now, the Chagos Islands has a rich history. It has a relationship with another island in the Indian Ocean, Mauritius. And I mention that because to understand what's going on, you have to understand the relationship. Mauritius and the Chagos Islands used to be partners. The Chagos Islands were what is called a dependency of Mauritius. And Mauritius, many, many years ago, beginning in 1715, was a colony of France. And while Mauritius was a colony of France, Mauritius established a relationship with the Chagos Islands. And then, beginning in 1814, France said, look, we're going to cede Mauritius and now the Chagos Islands, where we have our military base, to the United Kingdom. And they did. Mauritius and the Chagos Islands, 250 years ago, they might have been close, but they're not today. They don't share the same culture. They don't speak the same language. They don't visit each other. In fact, many of the people from Chagos lived in the United Kingdom over here. But here's what President Biden is doing and Vice President Harris. They say we need to grant independence to the Chagos Islands, but not let the people of the Chagos Islands run their country. We need to give the Chagos Islands back to Mauritius. Why? I mean, no offense, but that's cell-deep stupid. Why do Mauritius and the Chagos Islands don't have a relationship anymore, and we've got a military base here? I'll tell you why. The United Nations, and particularly the International Court of Justice, which has no jurisdiction over the United States of America and has no jurisdiction over the United Kingdom, which currently controls the Chagos Islands. They have scolded the United Kingdom. They said the United Kingdom is a colonizer. And the United Kingdom, the people of the United Kingdom are bad people. Now remember, this is coming from the United Nations. This is the same United Nations that has the following countries on its Human Rights Council: Somalia, Iraq, Venezuela, China. That's who thinks we ought to get rid of this military base. Okay, I mean, this is not some act of justice here. But in any event, the United Nations is saying, United Kingdom, you bad people, give the Chagos Islands back. But not let the Chagos Islands be free. They want to give the Chagos Islands back to Mauritius. And President Biden could stop it. And so could Vice President Harris. But they're for it. All in an effort to curry favor with the people at the United Nations, who walk around with their NPR tote bags and their organic broccoli and have great relationships with members of the media who they think write history. Why on God's green earth would we do that? Why? China, of course, is delighted. Why is China delighted? Now, the United Nations says, okay, well, we don't want to be too mean-spirited here. The America can keep its military base for 99 years, but you got to sign a lease, and we got to start paying Mauritius to stay there. China says, fine, that sounds good to us. Why? Because number one, China's already started currying favor with Mauritius. And number two, Mauritius will now be in charge of the security of the Chagos Islands and our military base and the waters surrounding it. China, Xi Jinping, he's as happy as a gopher in soft dirt. He'll be hacking the Mauritius security as soon as the trade is made. Now, President Trump, I hope you're listening to this. My good friend Senator Rubio, soon to be Secretary of State, I hope you're listening to what I'm talking about. What we're debating today is important. I don't mean to say that. And I'm not kidding you. I'm not going to bubble wrap it. If Senator Sanders' resolution passes, it will precipitate a foreign policy crisis. But this foreign policy crisis is being perpetrated or prosecuted right now, and it's another foreign policy crisis, and it's going on, all because President Biden. All because President Biden and Vice President Harris want to appease the United Nations and China. And President Trump, please, pretty please with sugar on top, pick up the phone and call the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and say, don't sign that treaty. Don't give away the Chagos Islands. Don't give away America's military base. Don't do it. If we object, they won't. If we don't say anything, they will. Madam Chair, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Maryland.
Madam President, over the past year, we have used our voices and influence to press for the protection of civilians in Gaza, for access to vital humanitarian assistance, to bring home the hostages, and to end this conflict. We all know that it's our responsibility to do more, Israel's responsibility to do more, and the international community's responsibility to do more to protect innocent victims. But even as we work to address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, we must be clear about our commitment to our long-standing bipartisan commitment to the State of Israel. It's been the bedrock of our foreign policy in the Middle East, a special relationship that was established in 1948 when President Truman, against the advice at that time of the State Department, because there were more Arab states than just one Israel, but against the advice of his State Department, President Truman recognized the State of Israel immediately after the United Nations vote. And that special relationship is based upon two countries, Israel and the United States, both democracies, shared values. We share intelligence information, military information, and much, much more. That special relationship is important to Israel, and it's important to America's national security interests. We both benefit from it. Part of that special relationship is the United States is committed to making available to Israel the military arms it needs in order to defend itself from the dangers in the region. We have mutual adversaries, Iran and its proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and many others. The threats are real. The adversaries are not just Israel's adversaries, they are our adversaries. Now, to the three resolutions that we have before us, and how does that relate to this issue? Senate Joint Resolution 111 deals with tank munitions. Now, Mr. President, these tank munitions have a delivery date 3 years from now. These are replenishments. This is so Israel has the capacity to defend itself against the future threats that we know are in the region, that are real. It's not engaged in the current conflict in Gaza or Lebanon. It's for Israel's ability to defend itself against the threats that are real in the region. Senate Joint Resolution 113, mortar munitions. Delivery date about 1.5 years from now. Again, it's for the replenishment of their supplies. It's to make sure that they're not caught in a situation where they can't defend themselves against future threats. This is the wrong vehicles for expressing ourselves in regards to the conflict that exists today. But if we are going to talk about the conflict that exists today, then the spotlight should be on Hamas, not Israel. The third resolution, Senate Joint Resolution 115, the JDAMs. This one I really don't understand. These are precision kits that go on munitions. They're not the munitions themselves. And without the JDAMs, the precision of the munitions is not as great. What does that mean? It means it has a much higher likelihood of missing the target. Collateral damage, civilians killed and injured. So it's counterproductive to the safety of the communities. I don't understand why we want to prevent Israel from having the technology to have precision use of its munitions. To me, that makes no sense at all. But as I pointed out, the spotlight should be on Hamas. Why are we in this conflict? October 7th, brutal attack by Hamas. We don't hear a lot of talk about that. The hostages. We talk about the release of the hostages. They never should have been taken. Why? Where's the outrage in the international community? Where's the outrage here about Hamas holding hostages, some of whom are Americans? That's where the outrage should be. Hamas uses human shields. Yes, we bereave the loss of innocent life, but Hamas makes it much more likely there's going to be the casualties of innocent life. They embedded themselves in hospitals and universities and make it so much more difficult for Israel to conduct a military campaign. Why isn't the focus on the terrorists? And then there's humanitarian assistance. We've heard from our own State Department people, as recently as today, that the challenges for humanitarian assistance is made so much more difficult because of Hamas using it as a weapon to deny its own people humanitarian help, making it extremely difficult for the deliveries to take place. So, Mr. President, I am somewhat confused. I don't understand these resolutions as furthering the cause for what the sponsor has indicated. The sponsor says that he disagrees that blocking these offensive arms sales will only embolden terrorist organizations such as Hamas and Hezbollah, as well as their sponsors in Iran. But if the U.S. Senate fails to provide the support to Israel now, what else would our adversaries believe? This would be a sign of weakness in our resolve to fight the terrorism in the region. It would be a gift to Iran. And let me talk about the cost. You hear a lot about taxpayer costs. Canceling these contracts, they have cancellation clauses. This will cost the taxpayers money, not save the taxpayers money. But I want to talk lastly about the timing of this. And I want to talk about, let me quote from the message we received from the Biden administration. These resolutions are particularly untimely and counterproductive as we are working to secure a ceasefire in Lebanon. U.S. officials are in Beirut now working to finalize this deal, a deal that is only possible because of the military pressure Hezbollah is under. Disapproving arms purchases for Israel at this moment would jeopardize those talks and put wind in the sails of Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas at the worst possible moment. Mr. President, these resolutions should be defeated. As the administration has said, we urge you to oppose the JRDs, which will prolong the wars, not shorten them, put Israel at risk, and inject wind in the sails of Iran and its proxies, just as they're facing an historic low point and looking for a deal. I urge my colleagues to reject all three of these resolutions. Let us continue to work together for peace in the Middle East. Let us work and isolate the terrorists in the region, Iran and its proxies. Let's work with our allies and partners in the region to do exactly that. Let's not make the matter worse by calling into question our commitment to make sure Israel has what it needs to defend itself against the future threats that are in that region. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
Let me begin by pointing out, although it may not be obvious here in the Senate, that poll after poll shows that a strong majority of the American people oppose sending more weapons and military aid to fuel Netanyahu's vicious and destructive war machine. And I would also add, because some of this has come up, that according to a poll commissioned by J Street, a pro-Israel Jewish organization, 62% of Jewish Americans support withholding weapons shipments to Israel until Netanyahu agrees to an immediate ceasefire. And let me just mention a few of the organizations who think that the time is now to stop giving money to Netanyahu, to ignore America's laws and our values. Some of the major trade unions in America, the SEIU, the United Auto Workers, United Electrical Workers, Amnesty International, the Arab American Institute, the Association of U.S. Catholic Priests, the Friends Committee on National Legislation, Oxfam America, the Episcopal Church, the United Church of Christ, the United Methodist Church, General Board of Church and Society, the American Baptist Churches USA, the Global Ministries of the Christian Church. These amendments, these resolutions have strong support all across this country by people who understand that we cannot continue to fund the horrific war machine and the atrocities that Netanyahu is committing. These resolutions come down to a few basic points. First of all, should the United States government obey the law? And the law is very clear, is that we as a government cannot fund other countries who are in violation of international human rights or who are blocking humanitarian aid. Now, if somebody here wants to come down and say, I don't like that law. The United States government should give money to any government they want, no matter what they do, no matter how atrocious their behavior is, come down and change the law. But that ain't the law now. The law is based on moral principles that says when the United States provides military arms, those countries that receive those weapons cannot violate international human rights and cannot block humanitarian aid. And that is precisely what Israel is doing. That's not me who says that. That is what virtually every humanitarian organization working in Gaza right now says. So if you believe that we should obey the law, you got to vote for these resolutions. Number two, from a moral perspective, we cannot turn a blind eye to one of the worst humanitarian disasters in the modern history of this world, a humanitarian disaster that we are significantly funding. My colleagues, as we speak, thousands and thousands of children in Gaza are starving to death. In an area of 2.2 million people, 43,000 are dead. Over 100,000 have been injured. We cannot turn a blind eye to that humanitarian disaster caused in part by U.S. financial support to Netanyahu. And thirdly, I heard about the United States' role in the world. Well, I will tell you that our role is significantly diminished if we continue to support Netanyahu and this humanitarian disaster that is currently taking place. What is the moral standard that we have to critique other countries? How do you critique Iran for their terrible human rights record? How do you critique China or Russia for their terrible human rights records? Because if you get here on the floor of the Senate and you make that critique, people around the world will laugh at you. And they will say, don't give us advice, don't criticize us when you have supported the mass starvation of children with your taxpayer dollars. So, Mr. President, this is a very important vote. It's an important vote because it tells the world that we will not continue supporting a government which violates American law, which violates international law, and which violates the humanitarian standards that I would hope every member of the Senate upholds. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Without objection. Questions on the motion to discharge?
Ayes?
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Thank you. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Brown. Mr. Budd. Ms. Butler. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Helmy. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Vance. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.